As opposed to the previous episode, the first of the two episodes that aired this week, I really liked the second of the two episodes. A very special episode, and I liked it for a lot of the same reasons that I have disliked a specific comedy-oriented episode in the past. Say, Uncle. Sorry, I got something abhorrent stuck in my throat there for a second. Now, this episode was weird, especially towards the end. It had a tone very reminiscent of that unspeakable monstrosity of an episode. And yet I really like this a lot, and I'm going to try to articulate why. This episode, to put it very, very simply, because this is one I feel that you should watch if you haven't watched it yet, rather than getting your summary of it from my review. It's about Steven being pulled in different directions. Garnet is trying to teach safety to some of the new gems, while Pearl is trying to take care of Onion. But it's not specifically Garnet and Pearl who are doing those things. It's Sunstone and Rainbow 2, which means Steven has to be present for both, which is particularly frustrating because they're happening at the same time. This causes Steven to be stretched super thin as he runs back and forth to deal with crises that Garnet and Pearl can't deal with on their own without him, for some reason, culminating in him bringing Onion along to the safety class, which leads to Onion leading a bunch of gems off a cliff to their deaths, and then Steven falling over at the end, seemingly also having died of stress. And the whole episode was clear foreshadowing of the fact that Steven is taking on more responsibilities than he can handle, that he needs to work through them in a more healthy way, rather than just letting them pile on, and that it's eventually going to culminate in something disastrous by the end. And that was all very funny, but what was most funny was when at the end it got super silly, as I already alluded to, and then it pulls back to reveal that this was all a PSA about not overworking yourself, hosted by Sunstone herself, or themself. I honestly don't know which one it would be. Okay, so Sunstone is she or they, and Rainbow 2 is he or they. Interesting. And I honestly think it's that little bit at the end which makes this episode okay for me, and relative to something like Say Uncle that I absolutely detest, because it brings it into the canon of the show. We don't exactly know which of the events that we saw were exaggerated and which weren't, but we can assume that several of them were, that this PSA that Sunstone was hosting was based on actual events that happened, but that those events were exaggerated for the purposes of making an effective PSA. So while we clearly aren't supposed to take the events of the episode at entirely face value, they are supposed to be exaggerated, and we're supposed to assume that they're being exaggerated. The episode does lean into stuff like Sunstone being effectively a 90s message show character, and Rainbow 2 being a Yondu Udonta reference. I'm very poppin', y'all! And we can assume that those things are actual bits of lore, that we're actually learning more about these particular fusions. But then stuff like the very clear nod to the fandom's desire to transform Onion into some sort of chaos god, those things were obviously jokes and exaggerations, or at least we could take them as jokes and exaggerations if we want to. The point is that by making this episode as it exists in the lineup of this show a PSA created by the characters, it brings the absurd events into the canon of the show in a way which doesn't compromise the overall tone of the show and make it more silly than I think it ever should be, if that makes sense. Whereas Say Uncle doesn't do that. Say Uncle is still a straight up non-canon episode, and I don't feel that it's valid to the rest of the series, regardless of how funny it is, and that hurts my enjoyment of it. Not to mention that the fact that this episode isn't entirely intended to be taken at face value, that we are supposed to assume that things were exaggerated here, invalidates some of the nitpicks that I otherwise would have had. I would expect, for example, Pearl to be able to handle any human child relatively easily because she's an alien with inhuman levels of stamina and intelligence. And the whole thing with Garnet freaking people out and causing disasters by using her future vision to visualize every possible way that they could become endangered doesn't make sense, because that's a thing that she already knew not to do. Like, we saw that in the past. So in any other episode, any episode that was intended to be taken entirely at face value, those things would have bothered me, but here they don't, because I can read them as intentional exaggerations by the characters when they were putting the PSA together in the first place. And as someone who likes to criticize and nitpick media, those things are a lot of fun. All of that stuff I was just talking about, with trying to figure out which parts of the episode are intended to be taken seriously and which aren't, that's a lot of fun. So already there's a fun factor here for me, but then the humor in this episode is just so on point. Like, there's this, which I might start using as a reaction meme in my reviews. It's so freaking good.
I'm combining all my responsibilities into one responsibility. It's brilliant. It's fine. I'm fine.
And then there's Amethyst popping in here at the end to lean real hard on the fourth wall, saying that she needs Steven now too because she hasn't seen him in 11 minutes. This being 11 minutes since the previous episode. It was just hilarious. This whole episode was pretty consistently funny, and then the end just brings it around to being one of the most hilarious episodes of the show overall, and I really liked it. I liked it a lot. It was probably unnecessary for this episode to be made, much like I feel that it was probably unnecessary for the last episode to be made, at least in the form that it was made in. But I can forgive this one, because at the very least, I think it succeeded in being as fun as it was intended to be. And while I don't think we need foreshadowing that Steven's piled on stresses and traumas are going to lead to something disastrous, since the entire fandom has been theorizing that that's what's going to happen pretty much since this show was announced, it's not like it's unwelcome, I guess. Point is, this episode's good, this episode's fun, and this is the kind of good, fun episode I wish we had gotten immediately after the more stressful volleyball, rather than something like Bluebird. As per usual though, guys, I'd like to know, what did you think of the episode? A very special episode. If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.